Good morning. Look at this day. Perfect. Beautiful. Beginning of summer. And now that we know that Mike Tyson is old and can't fight anymore, I think we're all ready to move on. Anyway, welcome to Exodus through Ancient Hours. We've been here for quite a while. And some of the sessions have been slightly technical. And maybe you could even ask yourself the question, or maybe you want to ask me that question. Sometimes I ask that question to myself. Why do we bother with these Old Testament passages? Why do we spend so much time on them? I think if you ask the average Christian, they'd say, well, look, we don't need to spend so much time on the Old Testament. What we need to focus on is we need to focus on the New Testament. And I think most of that comes from a lot of Christians realizing that some of the events in the Old Testament are it makes us a little bit uncomfortable if we're honest. The way we think about them on our own, the way we think about them when we with all our other friends, Christian friends who maybe believe in the same way, we might treat them a little bit differently. And I think the reason why it is necessary to face these ancient accounts, if you are a Christian, is because when you start digging into the well, excuse me, or if you start going down the rabbit hole of salvation, which is a rather central Christian idea, and you want to start finding out, where did we get this idea, right? So if you, for instance, think about what salvation might mean to you or how it comes about, and you go, oh yeah, well, that comes through Jesus, all right, and then you go back a little bit and you go say, oh, well, he had to be sacrificed so we could live, and you ask yourself the question, but why? You go to the writings of Paul, and the bottom line is you're going to end up in the story of Exodus. That's where you're going to, if you keep on asking why long enough, the story of Exodus is the place where we find really the cornerstone of the Christian salvation and the mechanism behind it. This idea that someone has to die so that others can be free and can live. All right. So that's the reason why these ancient accounts need to be studied. We need to look at them. We need to re-look them, re-evaluate them, because they really are cornerstone to a lot of Christian ideas, Christian dogmas that, to be honest, we, even as modern Christians 2,000 years later, I don't want to say blindly, but ignorant, well, not even ignorantly, we just accept things and we never delve into why we believe these things and where they actually come from. And I think a lot of Christians are guilty of that. Certainly have been guilty of that for most of my life. And I decided that I'm no longer doing that. I want to know why. I want to know how. I want to know where the ideas come from. And so it seems like you're always going to come back to the Exodus account if you're serious about what it means to be a Christian. Now, last week we dealt with the idea of the Passover lamb, the idea that God came and killed the firstborn of all of the Egyptians and all their livestock. And that did the Israelites not put the lamb's blood on their doorpost, their children would have been taken as well. And we connected that to a very ancient idea, which is not unique or novel in the Jewish world or even the Hebrew Bible. It's a much older idea that the firstborn of things belong to God and that he has the right to take them. And it seems like in the Passover story, he comes to, sit, boo boo, sit. This dog of mine. Good dog. All right. And so it seems like in the Passover account, in the Exodus account, God comes to execute this rite. And we said enough about that. Today we finally, like this thing. Today we finally move on to the actual departure from Egypt, right? And it's going to get interesting from here on. There's a lot of things that we need to talk about that people are not talking about. And we're going to do that today. So we're starting basically in Exodus 13, verse 17, and we're moving through to about 15, verse 21 in this session or this session together with the next. I think today is our 9th session. Now, obviously, the departure from Egypt is a huge key moment in the story or in the Exodus account. Finally, the Israelites get to leave Egypt, but they have one last and final obstacle to face, the Red Sea. And it seems like they are blocked by the Red Sea from escaping, and to add injury to, sorry, that's the right way, I can't remember how to say that in English, but insult to injury, or injury to injury in this case, the Egyptians, Pharaoh and his chariots are right behind them, and they are completely snookered. They have nowhere to go, and so the only outcome now is God has to provide some miraculous way out of this situation. So obviously the people, my word, this thing, it seems to be always going off worse when I'm busy with live stream. Um, so if God doesn't provide a miraculous way for these guys to get out of this, they're going to die right here, escaping from Egypt and dying just basically in front of the Red Sea. So the people are angry, they upset, they moan at Moses, of course, and this seems to be something that permeates his ministry towards them, his service towards them, is they're always moaning about them. So about him. Of course, miraculously, God through Moses provides a way for them through the Red Sea. And once they're through, this Red Sea collapses back on Pharaoh and his chariots, killing the bunch. And that seems to bring to an end God's revenge on the Egyptians for enslaving the Israelites and killing their babies, right? Finally, Pharaoh and Egypt are justly punished for their enslaving of God's son, Israel, and for then, of course, drowning the Hebrew male boys. And that's kind of the gist of it. But we are now at this point, we're getting pulled deeper into some really interesting facts that emerge after this. So obviously in 13 verse 17, Pharaoh lets the people go. And finally, as Moses had requested of him in chapter 8 already, and it's taken 8 chapters for Pharaoh to get with the program. Now, in Exodus 13, 17 to 18, we find a little portion that says that God led them, the Israelites, by a roundabout way rather than by the way of the land of the Philistines. So this seems to be quite interesting. You could ask some questions about that. It seems a little bit odd. If the Philistines were there at that time and they were a threat, surely this wouldn't have been a problem for the Israelites and God, that was doing great miraculous signs, if he could deliver them from the mighty Egyptians, which obviously the Philistines would have always paled in comparison to the mighty Egyptian empire. Surely he could just as well deliver them from the Egyptians, from the Philistines. And specifically also because we know that they are about to engage in a war with the Amalekites. They got weaponry, we're not sure exactly from where, but they got this weaponry and they were about to engage a fight with the Amalekites. So why not just go through the Philistines? We're not sure about that, but one thing we do know is that the mention of the Philistines here seems to be totally anachronistic. Now, what that means is basically that from archaeology and from world history, as we understand it, the Philistines were not, at this time, they were not really, my goodness, they were not established in their Philistine land as yet. Even if we take the latest possible date for the Exodus, it still puts us 150 to 200 years from the arrival of the Philistines. And we know that Philistines arrived from the Greek area of Europe, and that happened after the Great Bronze Age collapse. And even if they did arrive around this time, it would have taken time for them to become a kind of a powerful threat for 1 million Israelites, right? So we can see this here, that this is another clear indication that the writer of the Exodus account is writing from a much later time in which the Philistines had arrived and had become a forceful threat and a very powerful enemy of Israel. So it just gives us an idea that we're dealing with a story again, and we're doing this over and over again because it's in the mass of evidence that this becomes quite a clear point that Moses didn't write this, because he would not have known about the Philistines at all. Um, this is written from a much later point, from a point where Israel is already established in the land of Canaan, and they kind of looking back and writing this account from a much later time. And we're really talking about at least 400 to 600 years later. Okay, so we also, there is a mention in Exodus 13:19 of Joseph's bones that need to go with them. And this kind of connects the story back to the Genesis account, right? So at the end of Genesis, there's a statement that Joseph's bones need to go with him. And it connects Exodus to the greater story of Abraham and how this release from slavery was already promised to Abraham in Genesis 15:12 to 14. So it's a nice way to put these stories together. Of course, there's another thing, another event, or a characteristic of Exodus, or rather call it an event of Exodus, that ties it very neatly back to the encounter that Abraham had with God in the making of the covenant, very early on in Genesis 15, where basically a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire protects and guides the Israelites for the next 40 years in their time in the desert. This dual pillar of cloud and fire is a resemblance, or resembles or symbolizes the presence of God then that goes with them. But something very similar happened to Abraham when God made the covenant with him, with the half carcasses laying on the ground, a dark smoking pot, and a flaming torch was seen in this account as well. And it is absolutely no coincidence that this detail in this theophany to Abraham happens right after God tells Abraham of the Exodus account. So these two things tie the story of Exodus back into the Abrahamic account and the promises that were made to Abraham. Okay, so obviously the Israelites are terrified, but Moses tells them and reminds them that God will fight for them. And this is in Exodus 14, verse 14. They obviously blame Moses for every small thing that happens to them. And Moses then has to go talk to God to find a solution to all of these small things. But God says to them through Moses, I'm guessing, in chapter 14, verse 17 to 18, he says, I will gain glory for myself. Now, we've gone past the place where God has punished the Egyptians for what they've done to the Israelites. That's done now, and you could look at that and say, oh, that's justice. He got them back. It's now he had to punish their sin. Okay, fine, let's call that justice. But from here on, there's another kind of thing that comes out here that's really uncomfortable to deal with. That it seems that from here on, in the conquest of Canaan, the displacement of the Canaanite peoples, the killing of nations, people, kids, animals, seems to go into this view of God wanting to gain glory for himself. In other words, like a new warrior God that's on the scene that wants to build a reputation for himself. The God of the Israelites seems to be intent on building a vicious reputation amongst the nations. And I know these are kind of harsh words to hear, but it is in truth the honest summation of what's going on here. Somehow all this killing so far has kind of been justified by bringing justice to the Israelites for their bondage and their suffering in Egypt. But now here the motivation seems to shift from justice to building a reputation. Now, this building a reputation, of course, in the Old Testament can be found in the words that are so familiar to Christians, like the idea of glory. For instance, in the New Testament, at least, the idea of glory is very strongly connected to the idea of reputation. Old Testament, we have it connected to the idea of weight. Kabod, I think, is the Hebrew word, which also means the reputation of someone, but also the honor of someone. So it seems like the battles now from here on become about that, the honor and the glory of the God of the Israelites, to show that he is able to bring people, to protect people, to fight for them, and bring them into an inheritance that he had promised them from the beginning. Now, the writer of this book says the following. He writes a line. He says, God seems to be really into himself. Now, this is a little devil's advocate statement here, but there's a lot in here. And this is one of the things that I think if we read even the Old Testament, especially the early books, quite honestly, is we're not really dealing with someone who seems to be humble or even full of love, the type of love that we would find in Jesus, the type of agape, the love of enemies and the love of neighbor. We really seem to meet someone who seems to be into themselves, someone who's trying to promote themselves, put themselves on the map, and things are done for his glory, his honor, and his reputation. It seems to be a little bit self-centered, if you know what I mean. Now, it took me a very long time to be able to come to this conclusion, because my previous views had completely blinded me, so that I couldn't just read this for what it was actually saying. And then I started asking the questions, but why is God portrayed in this, I'll just call it a selfish way, for lack of a better word? I can think of some other words, I won't use them. And then I realized, and I really didn't realize this on my own, but I read extensively about other nations and how they saw their gods and how their gods acted according to them. And then it became clear that, at least in the Bible, it's not uncommon to see Yahweh portrayed in this way by the ancient Israelites, portrayed as a warrior king in pursuit of glory for himself, stopping at nothing to get vengeance or to create conquest. And this at first, of course, it's really uncomfortable reality to peer into, but it seems obvious to me now that this was the understanding of the Israelites of their God, right? And here's the key. Much of this was inherited from the ideas about the gods from the culture of that time. And when this penny dropped for me, I feel like I, for the first time, could read the Old Testament for what it's really saying, and not what the modern views I have imposed on it for so long. In the ancient world, the gods were like warrior kings, right? They were bent on gaining glory through proxy wars of their subjects. I don't want to say too much about this. This is quite an obvious statement. And if this is new to you, I suggest you read a little bit more about the way that religions operated during these ancient times. There's so much good information out there, so much reliable consensus material on how ancient religions function. And when you realize that, you realize that the Bible is not unique in the way that it is portraying its God, Yahweh, and it actually portrays its God in many ways similar to some of actually the ancient Canaanitic gods. For that, you can reference some material from that which was discovered, I think, 100 years ago, or maybe in the 20th century, of the Ugaritic uh, Akkadian tablets, in which we could read about the Ugaritic pantheon with Baal and El and Astaroth and the sons of God that they had, 70 of these children of God, and how they ruled the world and how they were portrayed as a warrior, Baal, for instance, as a warrior storm god. Um, and it is also then becomes quite obvious that some of the Israelites actually borrowed, some of our Psalms have borrowed pieces from these ancient praises to these Baal gods, El gods, God El. And that it just, all of this just comes down to the following, that the Israelites didn't see God much different than what other ancient peoples would have seen their pagan gods, warrior kings and storm gods. Right, so this doesn't mean, and here's the crux of this, is we don't necessarily have to accept the ancient Israeli cultural interpretation of these events and how they reflect on God. But we'll return to this issue again a little bit later. But I've mentioned this multiple times in the series because I believe it's one of the most important things you can learn about the Hebrew Bible is that they were not so different from the other ancient peoples in the ways that they understood God, in the ways that they interpreted their own history with reference or relative to God. And that's a real eye opener. Anyway, let's move on to something really interesting. And I have read about this quite a couple of times, and it's mentioned again here, and I need you to know about this. So we're going to talk about the Red Sea for a moment. Now, I think as far as I know, and you can pull your own map up and have a look at the Middle Eastern connection with Africa. On the west, of course, we have Egypt, and then on the right, separated by a gulf, is the Sinai Peninsula. And then on the right to that, the east to that, there's another gulf. And then on the other side of that is the old Midian, which is today, the Middle East, I think. All right. Anyway, the Red Sea for us today is not these. It's not these gulfs underneath the peninsula, to the sides of the peninsula, but the Red Sea actually is at the bottom here. So you might want to ask yourself, how in the world did these Israelites cross the Red Sea? Now, you need a map in front of you to ask this question properly. So I suggest you go and just have a quick look. It seems obvious that they didn't cross the actual Red Sea, what we call the Red Sea today, right? That seems to be quite obvious. It's like a 5-day journey or something. But there's something more important that we learn from this Red Sea. Okay. We don't actually know which body of water the Israelites crossed in the Exodus story. And this is not because we don't have any historical evidence. It is because from the story itself, it seems impossible to estimate what body of water they actually crossed. Now, firstly, the name Red Sea already is an issue, and it throws us off the scent. As I've just said, the Red Sea to us is this massive body of water between Africa and the Middle East below the Sinai Peninsula. But more interestingly is that the Hebrew word here for Red Sea is Yam Suf, which means the Sea of Reeds. Now, these are the reeds similar to reeds that you find around marshlands and around the Nile, for instance. The same stuff that was used to make, for instance, the basket that Moses was placed in, the Sea of Reeds. Suf in Hebrew does not mean red. It has never meant red, and it will never mean red. It means reeds. And so if we're reading the Hebrew properly, it should say simply the Sea of Reeds, right? So you might ask the question, then where in the world did we get the idea of the Red Sea? Well, something happened to the Hebrew Bible in around, I think it was like the 2nd to 1st century BC, in the Hellenization of the ancient Near East. Eventually, there were some Jews who basically became Greek in their language. They lived in Alexandria of Egypt, and they embarked on translating the Hebrew Bible into a Greek version. And this Greek version, of course, is called the Septuagint. This Greek version is the one that was used by our New Testament writers, like someone like Paul, for instance, would have had to his disposal the Septuagint, the Greek New Testament, right? And there's a lot of legend about how it came about. Septuagint, I think, means something connected to the word 70, because they believed, and unfortunately this is just legend, that they took 70 interpreters, put them in separate rooms, and they came up with the exact same translation. There's no historical evidence for that, but that was their way of trying to reinforce that just as the Hebrew language was inspired by God for the Bible, so the Greek version is also inspired by God. Leaving that aside, somehow the Greek interpreters of the Hebrew Bible translated the Hebrew word suf to the Greek word for red. And since that time, we have the crossing of the Red Sea. Now, this seems to me to be rather important loss of information. Because if we understand that the Hebrew Bible, our Bible that we look at and read and look for inspiration and understanding and knowledge, actually says the Sea of Reeds, we need to rethink what the Exodus looked like when the Israelites went through the Sea of Reeds. Okay, so calling it the Sea of Reeds isn't much help either, unfortunately, because it could literally be any marshy body of water in and around Egypt. And it is impossible to identify which one of these multiple marshlands with reeds around it this story is actually talking about. But it is one thing we can be certain of, or rather certain of, is that the Sea of Reeds does not refer to the massive ocean below the Sinai Peninsula on our maps that we call the Red Sea. It is nor likely that this Sea of Reeds was any one of the two gulfs that sit around the Sinai Peninsula. They called the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba, I think, today. We may have no clue, in fact, where this Sea of Reeds could have been or which one it actually was. But one thing we do know is that the Sea of Reeds holds huge symbolic significance in Exodus. And this symbolic significance is very hard to miss. And what it does is it puts the deliverance of Israel on the cosmic scale. And we're going to talk about that now. Why do we say that the movement through the Sea of Reeds puts the Israeli deliverance on the cosmic scale? We're going to do that in a moment. But I want to just say something briefly about, because some might say, but how does this work then? And how can a marshland open up and swallow up a whole army and so on? We don't know. But one thing we do know is that when we're reading Exodus, from what we can tell in the story itself, it seems like there's a historical kernel, a historical cultural memory that the Israelites held onto. But it seems also rather obvious that in the plagues, that was in session 7. And here again at the Sea of Reeds, we see the creation motive starting to reappear again. Well, in Exodus 14, verse 21, the sea is driven back by strong east winds that now turns the sea into dry land. The Hebrew word for wind, of course, is the word ruach, which means also spirit, wind, or breath. And this wind, of course, the ruach, comes from God. And this same ruach is used in Genesis, and again here, as the Sea of Reeds is hovered over in some sense by this spiritual wind over the face of the waters, and then brings a separation of waters. Like in Genesis, on day 2 of creation, God he splits the deep into two and he separates the waters above from the waters below, creates space for humanity, and creates basically the sky or the heavens, the natural heavens in this way. But even more than the second day split of water is the third day split of water in Genesis, where God separates the waters horizontally and makes dry land appear, setting the stage for the place where humanity will find their life. Will they be placed to live their life? Now, the crossing of the Red Sea seems to be a mini condensed version of this day 3 account, or a Genesis account. In Genesis, the earth was formed out of the water, and in Exodus, the hostile waters are split again, allowing dry land to appear, and the Israelites to have life through this dry land that they passed on. Of course, in a replay of the flood story, these waters come crashing down on the unrighteous, and it's a form of judgment that then takes place on the Egyptians. And in both stories, Genesis 6 and the Exodus Red Sea crossing, the water is used to cause the death of the unrighteous and the deliverance or the survival of the godly. So, even in the New Testament, we find some of these themes quite strongly. We find it in 1 and 2 Peter. Let me just read it for you. 2 Peter 3, 5-6. God waited patiently in the days of Noah during the building of the ark, in which 8 persons were saved through water. By the word of God, heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by means of water, through which the world of that time was deluged with water and perished. Jesus himself does make the same reference when he speaks about the imminent coming of the kingdom of God. He refers to the idea of the flood of Noah. The salvation then is again pictured in this collapsing of waters where unrighteous are destroyed and the righteous gain salvation. Um, Throughout the water, Bible either brings life or death, depending on which side you are on, of course. And the Creator God who orders the cosmos at the dawn of time is now again here in the same manner, saving the Israelites from the Egyptian army. As we saw earlier, deliverance or salvation is like a recreation event, a mini recreation event on a smaller scale. Paul himself also speaks about this in the New Testament when he says, if anyone is in Christ, if anyone is saved, that's how we would read that or understand it at least, he is a new creation. Everything old has passed away and everything has become new. So elsewhere in Paul ties baptism, which is a going through the waters, of course, which is an initiating rite to become a follower of Jesus in the scriptures. Um, in both instances, God is saving, and in both places by water. The water plays a critical role. It's a kind of starting over, a fresh beginning through water. Creation, floods, the Exodus, and the Gospels all tie this creation idea together. Now, I have 10 minutes left to speak about a very important and very interesting section of this part of Exodus. And this is in chapter 15 of Exodus. In chapter 15 of Exodus, we find a song that is sung by Moses and the Israelites. It is referred to as the Song of Moses, or sometimes the Song of the Sea. Exodus 15, 1 to 18, that is. It celebrates God's victory at the sea. The first line of the song is repeated in verse 21. And here it is sung by Miriam and the women. Right? So it seems like a repeat. Assuming that Miriam is the unnamed sister of Moses, who safeguarded Moses floating in a basket in chapter 2 of Exodus, she is present at both these water-saving events. Events that frame the departure from Egypt. Right, so this song is the poetic version of the prose in chapters 13 and 14. In other words, chapters 13 and 14 is the narrative account. But in chapter 15, we have a song about it, which is a more poetic account of the same Exodus event, which once again gives us basically two versions of the Exodus account, two versions of the same story. The two-version literary convention is found in several other places in the Bible. For example, the story of Deborah. It's not something we read a lot, but it's first told in prose or in narrative, right? In Judges 4, and then in poetry in Judges 5. Go check that out. It's very, very interesting. Scholars have long considered, and here's the takeaway, that the poetic versions, the song versions of these stories are to be considered the older of the two versions for various reasons, and we are not going to spend our time proving that or stating the reasons. But basically what you have then in Exodus, coming back to Exodus, is in chapter 13 to 14, you have a narrative version written by the writers. But then they bring in an older version, which is a poetic song version, which scholars believe was actually the first version of the story. And so the writing of the prose kind of follows off from this poetic version that was in song form, but you can just think about song form. Anything that's in song form, especially in an oral culture, will have longevity, right? It'll be able to live longer than a story. Also, people don't change songs so easily. They kind of, because of their poetic, rhythmic, melodic nature, they kind of stick in the mind. It's easier to memorize them. And this could be the reason why the song and the prose narrative sits together, even though the one is much older. It had the sticking power to end up in the Exodus account. And so it seems like the editors would have put these together because the song was very important to the people. They knew it. It was still alive at this time, 7th century. And then also the prose narrative version is one that obviously was redacted or edited by the final writers. Okay, so In fact, linguists consider Exodus 15, this song, and Judges 5, like we mentioned, the Song of Deborah, to be two of the oldest examples of biblical literature. Excuse me. So, as you know, we have estimated, scholars estimate that the Torah was written more or less in the 7th century. It's just more or less, right? Okay. But it has some portions in it that could be older. Most of it is at least from the time of David and later, which is about the second beginning of the second millennium, beginning of the first millennium BC. Sorry, but they estimate that these songs are probably even older than that. That these songs of Moses and Deborah, Song of Miriam and Deborah, Exodus 15, Judges 5, could be as old as 1200 BC. Now that is, in terms of the Bible, that is ancient. It's still not actually on the time or from the time that the Exodus could have taken place. The latest date we have as 13th century, but at least within 200 years, let's say, 100 to 200 years from this historical kernel that we're talking about here. There was a song that was written, and that we seem to still have. And so not only is this the oldest part of the oldest version of the story, it seems to be some of the oldest material we actually have in the Bible. Um, but some of the narrative and the Song of Moses seems to be out of sync, and that just stands to reason. You have a song that's 500 years older than the account you're writing, so it's obvious that there are going to be some things that are slightly out of sync because the story might have developed along a different route than the song itself. One of the differences, and perhaps one of the most striking differences, is the song doesn't really mention something that's absolutely central to the narrative, the splitting of the sea. And you can go read it yourself and check it out. But perhaps the song version doesn't mention the Red Sea parting because it does not need to. We don't know, we're not sure. But it seems like the song version describes the death of the Egyptians differently. Yahweh threw horse and rider into the sea. This is 15 verse 1. And the Egyptian chariot um, sank to the depths of the sea like lead. Now, you see, this is quite strange because if it collapsed on them, they would already be at the bottom and they would just drown and it's over. But in the song version, it looks different. Like they went into the sea and sank into the sea. So it's you could argue about this. Say, oh yeah, well, that's just a poetic way of saying it. But on face value, it does seem like there's quite a difference in how the Egyptians actually died in the song version. Verse 10 doesn't mention the wind, but only to overwhelm the Egyptians and to drown them, more like a kind of a flash flood of sorts. And so some scholars have concluded that the earliest version of the Exodus story did not in fact include the splitting of the sea. That detail is something that evolved later when skillful editors started to weave this account into the Genesis account. So the splitting is something that came later because the editors were connecting this to a Genesis salvation, a recreation salvation event. So the skillful editors wove the stories of old into the grand narrative we call the Pentateuch or the Torah, tying Exodus explicitly to Genesis 1. We can see that although it has been embellished over time, the Exodus story is a very old tale, of course. One might estimate it as one of Israel's oldest memories. So it's quite an interesting thought to think about, that this thought of the Exodus could be older than actually the thought of Abraham. And older than the thoughts of Adam and Eve or Cain and Abel, or the flood itself. This is a possibility that this is one of the oldest memories that's been preserved for us. Part of this ancient memory is the depiction of God as a fierce and a violent warrior who's to be praised for killing a lot of people. How do we deal with this? It's not uncommon to hear scholars muse that Israel's oldest view of God is that of a warrior king. Now, you might be surprised, and I was too, to consider the fact that even in the Hebrew Bible itself, the Old Testament, there is an evolving view of God. It's not uncommon to hear scholars speak about this, that God in the very oldest forms is a warrior king type of God that literally is out for blood to show himself strong and wants power and wants to build a reputation. And that later on, God's portrayal in the Hebrew Bible starts condemning violence like that. And it seems like God becomes more loving, if I can put it in very simple terms, as we move on chronologically in the Old Testament. It's also not uncommon to find scholars speaking about God becoming more and more distant in the Hebrew Bible. What do you mean by that? What I mean by that is the earliest thoughts, God is like on earth. He appears on earth. He walks in the garden. He's around. He's very much in touch and intuitive, and not intuitive, in touch and in connection with the earth in a visible, manifestable way. And then later on, he becomes more and more lofty and elevated, so that he is more considered to be spirit that only interacts through other mediaries. This is a common theme that you find, and it's you can read about that. The point is just simply that in the Song of the Bow, we find this very early view of God, literally like a warrior type king that just comes out and all guns blazing, drips his arrows and blood. It's about the blood and the victory. Okay, so it's really tempting. It's a really tempting thought that over centuries, other metaphors for God then eventually starts entering the canon. All later ideas about God as, for instance, a gardener or a potter or a planter or a lawgiver. It is really tempting and a little bit reductionist to consider ancient depictions of God as having evolved from a violent and a vengeful to a more controlled and a less violent God later on in the Hebrew Bible. But it might explain why later in the Old Testament, God is portrayed as less violent and less harsh, less directly involved in mass killings. In some cases, God even appears to oppose the very acts of violence that were once divinely declared okay early on in the Hebrew Bible. For example, the book of Nahum praises God's destruction of the Ninevites, right? The capital of Assyria, an enemy superpower. However, in the book of Jonah, that's written after Nahum, God has compassion on the Ninevites. You can see there's a softening that takes place. Now, this is not, the point is that it is the people themselves that are transitioning in their view of God. It's not God that's changing. It's people's view of him that's evolving. Similarly, Jehu's bloody slaughter of Ahab's descendants in Jezebel or I think that might be Jezreel, pleases God greatly in 2 Kings. But the prophet Hosea, speaking later, speaking for God, of course, sees this differently. And I quote, "For in a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezebel." Now God is not so happy with how Jehu handled all of this. And I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. And God's kind of like balancing the scales in Hosea 1 verse 4. Now, it seems that Exodus 15, the Song of Miriam, is written in an older mode, and it's praising Yahweh for destroying his enemies and drowning them in the sea. And if you go read the song, it's pretty harsh language. For instance, let me quote from verse 1 to 3, and it sets the tone for the rest of the song. "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider has he thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Yahweh is his name." And for drowning with the Egyptians, Yahweh, the warrior God, is praised as unequaled amongst the gods. And this is also a characteristic of a more ancient view of the Israelites, is that they still believed in many gods, of which Yahweh was one, possibly supreme, but one amongst many. So in chapter 15, verse 11, let me quote, "Who is like you, O Yahweh, amongst the gods?" So this portrays that very ancient view of the Israelites. One obvious answer, excuse me, think my time is kind of up, but I assure this is a little bit. I think we're going to stop here for today. Yeah, because I want to spend enough time on the rest of this song. So we're going to cut this short here. Next week, I want to speak to you about some of the. In this song, it seems like someone gave this song a bit of a makeover because there's stuff in here that shouldn't be in here, and that could only be in here if someone at a later time fiddled with the song. That's all for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next week. Cheers.